Good morning. I'm Kevin Clements, the director of the Toda Peace Institute, and it gives me very great pleasure to welcome you all to the launch of what we're calling the Democracy Lighthouse. This Lighthouse project emerges from a generic theme on global challenges to democracy. It evolved from a workshop that we held in Boston last year, in June last year, where our colleague John Keane thought it would be a very, very good idea for us to kind of try and work out who else in the world was going to be working on issues around governance and democracy, the erosion of democracy, and the seemingly remorseless drift towards autocracy and authoritarianism. And so the Lighthouse idea was then developed, and it gives me very great pleasure to welcome its ideological founder, Professor John Keane, to talk about his aspirations for the Lighthouse and how it fits into our wider concern to ensure that democracy isn't further eroded over the course of the 21st century. So, over to you, John.
Thank you very much, Kevin. Ohayo gozaimasu. Good morning, everybody. I think it's appropriate that there was heavy fog this morning in Tokyo, and of course, in heavy fog, a lighthouse is needed. I want to say a few words about the Democracy Lighthouse, which is now launched. After 7 or 8 months of quite hard work, it is an independent, open access global guide, perhaps the world's first, to the organizations and networks that are currently researching and reimagining and advocating democracy. The site so far contains around 200 entries, listed by continent and country and alphabetically. There are more to come. It's funded, as Kevin has already said, by the Toda Peace Institute. It's an integral part of the Global Challenges to Democracy program. Democracy Lighthouse is not party political. It is an independent beacon, and it's a distributor of information about the global subversion and renewal and rejuvenation of the spirit and substance of democracy. Redaction happens. There is editing. We have tried very hard to edit out sites that are merely propaganda sites, we could say. So selectivity is part of this global initiative. It does not, however, Democracy Lighthouse doesn't comment on the work of the organizations and networks it lists. But it is shaped, framed, if you like, by 4 precepts. And I want to say just a few words about each of these precepts. First of all, this Democracy Lighthouse is on the side of democracy. It takes the side of democracy, understood as popular self-government and a whole way of life committed to the non-violent refusal of power exercised arbitrarily and often foolishly over humans and their ecosystems. It insists that democracy in this sense is an indispensable planetary ideal. And therefore, the Democracy Lighthouse raises suspicions and opposition to demagogues and bureaucrats and technocrats, to supporters of one-party rule, to believers in simple solutions, or believers in benevolent dictators or good kings and queens. Democracy Lighthouse is born of a very strange and difficult age, marked, for example, by a bonfire of democratic vanities. This platform understands that there are certain old orthodox ideas that no longer seem plausible. For instance, that democracy is a friend of peace, or that the United States is the founder and loyal defender of a liberal democratic rules-based order, or that democracy happens when per capita income reaches $5,000 US, or that there is no alternative to democracy, not even in China. Or it's a topsy-turvy world in which, for example, an organization such as the Alliance of Democracies, based in Copenhagen, has just released a report in which there are some countries where it's believed by at least 75% of its population that they live under democratic conditions. And those countries, ranked in rank order, are China, Switzerland, Singapore, Israel, and so on. An Alliance of Democracies report, as part of this topsy-turviness, in which Japan is among the countries in which a majority of the population believes that they do not live under democratic conditions. This Democracy Lighthouse is also born of an age of polarization and bitterly contested realities, in which what the French call ressentiment is flourishing. Ressentiment, this feeling of citizens, of anger, of envy, of isolation, of wanting to take revenge, is an autoimmune disease of democracy. It's a virus of this populist pandemic through which we're living. And it's reinforced everywhere, the Lighthouse supposes, in which there is the spread of friend-enemy and fighting dirty, symbolized by Roy M. Cohen. You may know of him, Trump's original fixer, his mentor, his lawyer, who taught him the following rules: always deny wrongdoing, attack the attackers, lie and bullshit, get lawyers willing to do anything, never apologize, destroy your enemies. There is a third precept which guides the Democracy Lighthouse. It is that there is a need to globalize our understanding of democracy. And in this respect, I want to make a reference to a scholar about whom you may know nothing, named Radha Kamal Mukherjee. He was known as the professor who was the friend of the poor, who 100 years ago published, I think, the first book called Democracies of the East, where he predicted that the spread of the spirit and substance of democracy to the East would change its dynamics and character, that Eastern democracies would be different. Democracy Lighthouse is in a way inspired by this thought. The subject of democracy, it supposes, can't any longer be thought about or investigated or reported or practiced as if the West holds the keys to democracy and its future. There's a deliberate decentering, not elimination, of the Atlantic region, representation on the Democracy Lighthouse platform. You will see some examples of this as you scroll through. For example, it's not just that Europe and Asia are strangely brought together in one category, but it's a platform that grants visibility to, say, Ghana's West Africa Democracy Solidarity Network, WADEMOS. It's a very important organization in West Africa. Or which gives prominence to Delhi's CSDS, the Center for the Study of Developing Societies, the first institute in India, established in the early 1960s to study democracy. It gives visibility to Mexico's INE, a very important institution in resisting Obrador, much more than an electoral commission, and gives visibility, yes, to the Chilean Antarctic Institute, INACH. Unusually, I think this site includes Antarctica as a continent where democracy matters and has everything to do with the Antarctic Treaty, which is the world's first modern cross-border power-sharing institutional arrangement, which happened before that in Europe. Democracy Lighthouse, therefore, pays attention and it gives publicity to the wider significance of democratic innovations that are happening in areas outside of the Atlantic region. For example, South African-style truth and reconciliation commissions, religious courts in Indonesia, secularism in India, guaranteed parliamentary representation for indigenous peoples, as in New Zealand, or in the Philippines, citizen-led election audits. This decentering of the Atlantic region, which you will see when you scroll through this site, raises a very key question, you will note. Since 1945, a heavily armed and wealthy empire, not for the first time in the history of democracy, played the role of protector and champion of democracy. For a brief period, as we know, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, this empire trumpeted the global victory of democracy, of what its leaders and journalists and intellectuals called liberal democracy. This global democracy and its power, the United States, of course, isn't to be underestimated in these topsy-turvy times. 800 military bases in 75 countries, currently bogged down in 2 major wars. Arguably, it is in decline. This has everything to do with the so-called rise of China. And so Democracy Lighthouse raises a question. Can the democracies of the European Union, can less powerful democracies such as Japan, survive under conditions in which they are not protected by an empire? Is it possible that there is a future for democracy without, say, the unconditional support of the United States? And finally, Democracy Lighthouse indeed acknowledges the polarization, the bitterly contested realities, the power grabbing, the spread of violence, and the spreading global sense. Think of Gaza and the West Bank. The democracy is hypocrisy. It is indeed haunted by the question, is this as bad as it gets? Can things grow worse? Is democracy on the way to becoming an empty, floating signifier? But Democracy Lighthouse is guided by the precept, the 4th precept, that we are passing through times of growing uncertainty in which pessimism, the dogmatic belief that everything's bad or bound to get worse, and optimism, the equally dogmatic and foolish belief that everything will work out well, are not plausible options. And that therefore, in this period of great uncertainty, opportunities for the defense and the reimagining and renewal of the spirit and substance of democracy are possible. In other words, this platform embodies the belief that the spirit and substance of democracy is never consolidated. It's always in the process of becoming something else. It has a fugitive quality, as the American scholar Sheldon Wallen pointed out repeatedly. Or as Jacques Derrida, the French scholar, said, democracy is always the democracy to come. I've tried to say that democracy is the friend of uncertainty. It denatures power. It stirs up the sense that things are not necessarily so, that things can be different, that democracy has the capacity to transform itself, that democracy has a punk quality, that its punk spirit, the refusal of bossing and bullying, is not to be underestimated, not even in settings such as Singapore or Vietnam or China, where rulers rule from the top down in the name of democracy. Friends, colleagues, in 1927, the famous and very influential English writer Virginia Woolf published a novel, To the Lighthouse. It's a meditation on life as propelled by often frustrated yearnings to reach our goals, life as moving to but never quite reaching the lighthouse. This book, as you know, was denounced as perverse. It was banned, and repeatedly has since encountered trigger warnings in many editions and translations. Let us hope, forgive the comparison, that Democracy Lighthouse fares a little better, serving as a trusted guide, as Abdul Wahab El-Afendi, one of the endorsers of the site, puts it. It serves as a trusted guide to all democracy mariners, wherever they are in everyday life settings, in cities, in regions, in states, in cross-border institutions in which people refuse arbitrary exercises of power. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, John. And you can see why John was the intellectual inspiration for this lighthouse. and his team at Sydney University, helped by Nobu here at the Toda Peace Institute, have been working very hard to kind of implement his vision for the lighthouse. One of the things which struck me as you were talking, John, was the necessity for a globalist study of democracy. We need to deepen that notion that democracy is not just a national phenomenon, but something which transcends national boundaries and borders. And for that reason, we decided that we would invite 3 of our new members of the steering group on Global Challenges to Democracy to talk about what this new website means from their own perspectives in the Middle East, in Latin America, and in Southeast Asia. And it gives me very great pleasure, therefore, to introduce you to Professor Labi Siddiqui, who's fellow of the Japanese Society for the Promotion of Science based at Chiba University. He's held an enormous number of academic positions, which I won't name, and his most recently published book with Leila Saleh is Revolutionary and Democracy in Tunisia. So it gives me very great pleasure to call on you, Labi, to give us some sense about why this lighthouse is important for you and your work and for the work of all people in the Middle East who are trying to work out ways in which they can indeed develop and consolidate democracy in their own countries.
Thank you very much indeed. It's indeed an honor to be part of this forum. It's a forum that connects really all of us. I think around an idea which in my mind is like the best thing we can introduce and maybe redefine democracy as in a minimalist way. It's the representation of difference. And I think that really comes through very clearly in the introduction by Professor King and Professor Clements. So when we say a representation of difference, then like suddenly there's like the notion of decolonizing democracy, because in its millennial journey on the path to light up how people actually receive democracy and define for themselves democracy, because democracy is expected to change people, but people also have got like the right through collective ownership of democracy to change democracy. So like the notion of a single fixed democracy, is I think really part and parcel of this idea of decentering democracy. So this symbiosis, this democratic symbiosis, is really what makes actually democracy democratic. This is really, for me, like the crux of what democracy is for the inheritors of the traditions in Latin America, of Africa, and the Arab Middle East, where you've got actually millennial traditions of scholarship. And that scholarship is about ta'addudiyya, which is pluralism, which is congenial to democracy, but it's also a brand of democracy that does not exclude Western democracy, liberal democracy, because I guess really, as has been very astutely and clearly pointed out by Professors Clements and Keane, that we are at the moment really plugged into a globalization, a brand of globalization that is fraught with so much tension and so much conflict. And for me, the most terrifying thing is to live in a world in which the Western democratic world is not actually liberal and is not democratic. That's like really a fearsome idea in my head. So I think like, this lighthouse is actually something that joins all of these brands of knowledge making, knowledge practices, brings them together to decenter democracy into something that is actually the ownership of everyone without any kind of narcissism or ethnocentrism. And I think that's promising. It's a promising project. I'm honored to be part of this group of great minds.
Thank you, Lavi, and thank you for reminding us that there are multiple perspectives on what we understand by democracy, and democracy itself is an ever-changing political system. So now it gives me very great pleasure to welcome Daniela Campello. She's an associate professor of politics and global affairs at the Getúlio Vargas Foundation's Business and Policy School in Rio de Janeiro. and she's a member of the working group on reimagining global economic governance, which is led by Carnegie's New Global World Order. And it gives me very great pleasure to welcome you to give us your reflections on what the Democracy Lighthouse means for you in Latin America.
Very happy to be here, and as a citizen and as a scholar of Latin America, of Brazil, I've been through a process of, I've been witnessing the process of democratic backsliding in the country, and this was very traumatic for all of us. What's happening right now in Brazil, it's not singular. We can see countries like El Salvador, Peru, Argentina going through the same process of backsliding. And at this point, what we need is to connect, to get together. Sometimes it's really hard. We don't have the resources to get together. We don't have information about each other. So to me, it's a particularly interesting initiative to have this democratic lighthouse and access to so many institutions in different countries which are working together, trying to understand, trying to defend democracy in this process of backsliding. This is a very particular moment for Latin America. We are very disenchanted with democracy. Most citizens in Latin America now feel that democracy is not delivering, that they don't have that many expectations about what democracy has to bring for their lives in terms of improving their lives. So I think it's a very key moment for us to get together, to work together, not only to understand, but also to defend the democracies of Latin America and other countries in the world. So it's a very welcome initiative. Thank you.
Thank you. Finally, I'd like to introduce Professor Aris Aragay, who's Professor and Chair of the Department of Political Science at the University of the Philippines in Diliman. She's been working on civil-military relationships and democratization, security sector reform in Southeast Asia. So welcome to you, Aris.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be in this launch of the Democracy Lighthouse. In my country, the Philippines, and elsewhere in Southeast Asia, the light of many democratic societies have been dimmed by populist authoritarian rule, pernicious polarization, and massive disinformation. But at the forefront of the resistance against democratic backsliding are academics, civil society, organizations, activists, and even ordinary citizens collectively organizing to shed some light, further light, regarding democracy. Initiatives like the Democracy Lighthouse that contains a repository of many brave and selfless organizations that faces tremendous challenges and risks, not only for democracy to survive, but to also thrive in these turbulent times. As one of the fastest rising and dynamic regions in the world, a majority of the 673 million people in Southeast Asia still do not live in free and democratic societies. Many countries in the region continue to be governed by different variants of authoritarian and populist rule. As democracy's political legitimacy in the region still remains a question rather than an assumption, inspiration from different initiatives to advocate for democracy would be very much welcomed by Southeast Asians. And at the personal level, this project not only symbolizes scholarly pursuit, but a search for a better democracy, a better imagination of democracy that I think is the endless project that all of us should be undertaking.
Thank you very much. So it gives me very great pleasure now to I wish I had a ribbon to cut, but it gives me very great pleasure to launch, well, it's probably not the right metaphor, to launch the Democracy Lighthouse, since a lighthouse is supposed to be standing on solid ground, guiding us all away from the dangers and perils of authoritarianism.
Turn on the light.
Turn on the light towards something which gives much more weight to citizens, their ability to participate in deliberative decision-making, and where there's respect for the rule of law, where there are controls on the executive, where there are high levels of accountability for political action. So thank you, John, for your inspiration in launching and giving us this idea for a Democracy Lighthouse. Thank you all who've worked on its development and inception. And thank you all for giving us your perspectives from Latin America, Southeast Asia, and the Maghreb. This is indeed a global project, and one which is going to be challenging our grandchildren and our great-grandchildren as they work to make sure that they have a voice in the 21st century. Thank you very much.